The State of Israel was born on the 14th of May, 1948, approved by both the United States and the Soviet Union, but hated by neighboring Arab states who at once attacked the cuckoo in the Arab nest. Contemporary British newsreels described the situation as they saw it.
Abdullah of Transjordan, FAROUK of Egypt, and Ibn Saud of Arabia unite the Arab world against the Jewish state. Abdullah alone commands an efficient fighting force, the Arab Legion, trained and equipped by Britain under the terms of her treaty with Transjordan. Unless United Nations declare Abdullah the aggressor, Britain remains bound by the treaty.
Israel won. Her soldiers had gained experience as Jewish underground fighters during the previous British rule of Palestine, but it was a close-run contest. As a result, the new Israeli state ended up bigger than a United Nations resolution of 1947 had intended. This had recommended partition of Palestine into two states, one Arab, one Jewish. Most important for Israel, she took one half of Jerusalem, which the UN had scheduled as international. Transjordan seized the other, the eastern half, plus what's now called the West Bank. The British had ruled Palestine under a League of Nations mandate from 1922 to the birth of Israel. It was a turbulent period, with Britain paying the price of conflicting promises made to Arabs and Jews. Jews had been promised a national home in Palestine, so a regular flow of immigrants began, which Palestinian Arabs living there resented. Hitler's Holocaust in Europe added to the post-war immigration pressures. The war produced the first Palestinian Arab refugees fleeing to camps in neighboring Arab states, never to return. Jews, by contrast, were flocking in. Israel's proud boast then was of making the desert bloom. Under the law of return, any Jew could become an instant citizen. Immigrants came, particularly from Arab states where Jewish life had become difficult because of antipathy to Israel. They were needed to build the new state, which forged ahead fast in the 1950s. King FAROUK, who came to the throne in 1937, was overthrown in 1952. Colonel NASSER, who later became president, emerged as a popular leader, modernizing Egypt, seizing big land holdings, starting grandiose developments such as the ASWAN Nile Dam. When the Americans and the British refused to help finance it, he nationalized the Suez Canal in July 1956. Britain was outraged.
Sanctity of contract is one of the foundations on which all international peace and security depend. And if governments are not prepared to observe those contracts, if they can with impunity tear them up, then we are, in our judgment, striking at the foundations of peace and security. That was true in the 1930s, and it's still true today.
Angered by Nasser's seizure of the waterway in which they had shares, Britain and France plotted with Israel to teach Nasser a lesson. Israel's army struck across the Sinai Desert in what became the Second Arab-Israeli War and pushed on to the Suez Canal. Following the Anglo-French attack in October, British newsreels set the tone.
It's up to everyone here in Britain to do everything in our power to back up all our forces who are so coolly and efficiently carrying out their duties. Down below, we can see a bridge that's been blown up.
There was a furious debate in Britain about the British role, and in the United States, President Eisenhower was angry.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. We believe these actions to have been taken in error, for we do not accept the use of force as a wise or proper instrument for the settlement of international disputes.
Under American pressure, the British and French troops withdrew from Egypt and were replaced by United Nations soldiers. Israeli troops too finally retreated to their borders. Israel gained two achievements. The Straits of Tiran, which Nasser had closed, was reopened to her shipping, and the UN force was to supervise Egypt's border with Israel. Nasser was now a national hero. Israel had won the war, but Egypt had gained the peace. The Soviet Union, now friendlier than ever, agreed to pay for the ASWAN dam, to supply Egypt with more arms and thousands of military advisors to train Egyptian forces. Beaten again, but each time the Arab side came back, strength renewed. Nasser built up his armed forces in the mid-60s and fell victim to his own propaganda about Egypt's might. And all this time, the common enmity they still felt for Israel was the Arabs' one unifying factor. In May 1967, the UN was ordered out of Egypt at short notice by President Nasser. He reinforced his troops in Sinai, concluded quick defense treaties with Jordan and Syria, then blockaded the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. A fatal move. Israel had already warned him that this action would lead to war. On the 5th of June, Israel struck. Hundreds of Egyptian warplanes were destroyed on the ground. Jordan was given the chance to stay neutral, but King Hussein felt he had to support Nasser. His aircraft too were destroyed, along with Iraq's and Syria's. In 6 days, the Israeli army, safe from enemy air attack, took Sinai, the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights, enlarging its territory fourfold. But there was a price. Above all, Israel reunited Jerusalem, seizing the eastern half from Jordan and annexing it almost at once. This was followed by another great exodus of Palestinian Arabs, many moving on from refugee camps in the Jordan Valley where they'd lived since 1948. Most would never return. The UN Security Council met, but the war was so quickly over that the UN could do little but pass Resolution 242 in November 1967, calling on Israel to withdraw from occupied territories. Israel, Egypt and Jordan all accepted the resolution in principle, and 242 became the basis for any future peace negotiations between Israel and the Arab states. The Arabs, though, were bitter. Meeting at Khartoum on the 1st of September, they'd come up with 3 resounding no's. No negotiation with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no peace with Israel. Palestinian Arabs outside Israel now reorganized themselves into the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, to fight their cause. Yasser Arafat, the PLO chairman, came to symbolize their struggle. The PLO grabbed world attention with a series of terrorist incidents, such as the hijacking of the airliners, which they blew up at Dawson's Field in Jordan. And at Lod Airport in Tel Aviv in May 1972, when nearly 100 people were killed or wounded. And the murder of Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics. Brutal stuff, but the world took notice. Arafat's 1974 speech at the UN was the PLO's high spot. Egypt, meanwhile, had lost its champion. In 1970, Nasser had died, receiving a hero's funeral. Sadat, his successor, turned out to be bold and crafty. In 1972, he expelled more than 15,000 Soviet advisors, but still relied on Soviet arms. He was courting the Americans whilst preparing for another war, rehearsing his army for the recapture of the Suez Canal from Israel. Sadat wanted his occupied land back. He re-established Egypt's broken links with King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, so ensuring himself oil money to tackle the coming fight. And he teamed up with Syria, whose President Assad was to be an ally vital to his plans. On October the 6th, 1973, Egyptian troops crossed the Suez Canal. Syria attacked simultaneously in the east. It was Sadat's tit for tat. The Israelis were caught napping. Overconfident from their success in 1967, they never dreamed the Arabs would risk a repetition of that drubbing. Egypt's jubilation was short-lived. After wobbling perilously for 2 or 3 days, Israel fought back. The Israelis out-generaled both Arab armies, only to be robbed of complete victory by the Americans and the Russians, who intervened to impose a peace. Each superpower saw the danger that Middle East war could suck them in, not to collaborate, but to clash. In this war, a new weapon was born: oil. For a time, Arab oil producers embargoed supplies to the Americans and the Dutch, making an example. To the west, the weapon was a threat, shaping American diplomacy for months to come. Henry Kissinger, the US Secretary of State, developed an even-handed policy towards Israel and the Arabs, which Israel didn't like one little bit from the nation she rated as her best friend. By stopping the '73 war before the total rout of Sadat's troops, Kissinger and the Russians enabled Sadat to survive, still a hero to his own people. The Americans and Russians co-sponsored a peace conference in Geneva, with the Americans making all the running, but Syria stayed away. It was Dr. Kissinger's famous shuttles between Israel and the Arab capitals that resulted in military disengagement agreements with partial Israeli withdrawals from occupied land. There, the process stuck. In return for being cooperative, Israel received massive American aid and military help in re-equipping her armed forces. But Israel's long-ruling Labour Party paid the price of financial scandals and for stories of unpreparedness in 1973. Menachem Begin, the Likud opposition leader, was elected Prime Minister in 1977. A tough conservative who resisted all US efforts to reconvene the Geneva Conference and spoke of the occupied West Bank as part of historic Israel. Jimmy Carter, now American president, had been trying to breathe life into the deadlocked peace process, inviting both Palestinian and Soviet participation. The one alarmed Begin, the other Sadat. Egypt's president played a trump card. On November the 19th, 1977, he flew to Jerusalem, to the heart of enemy territory. He addressed the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, and amazed the world. Until that day, all Arab leaders had refused even to acknowledge Israel's existence, despite constant reminders on the battlefield. Sadat's journey broke the boycott, offering the first real hope of peace for a generation. Other Arab leaders, though, were furious with him for breaking ranks. Even so, it took President Carter himself summoning Sadat and Begin to talks at Camp David in the United States almost a year later in 1978 to make anything concrete out of Sadat's extraordinary journey. After 12 fraught days, with Carter as ringmaster, the trio agreed on a framework for Middle East peace. What they achieved was the outline of an Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty and a proposal for Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza to run their own affairs, but short of an independent state. Another 6 months passed. President Carter had to go to the Middle East before getting Egypt and Israel actually to seal their peace treaty. The treaty was signed in Washington. It was the end of an era. Egypt recognized Israel, and relations were to be normalized. President Sadat got back Sinai in staged withdrawals. Begin made his first official visit to Egypt in 1979, but it was a cold peace in the early years. The PLO had by now set up shop in Lebanon. They felt that Sadat had got his peace all right, but Camp David offered no practical progress towards theirs. The Rabat Summit of Arab Leaders in 1974, the year when the PLO was at its peak and was then recognized as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. A month later, Arafat, in triumph, had addressed the UN General Assembly, brandishing, in his words, a gun and an olive branch. Neither was to profit the Palestinian cause much. President Sadat paid for swimming against the Arab tide and was assassinated by Muslim fanatics in 1981. Mr. Begin and former President Carter attended his funeral, but Egyptians hardly mourned him. Hosni Mubarak became president and custodian of the peace with Israel. With the Arabs, as ever, at sixes and sevens, Israeli settlement of Jews on the occupied West Bank speeded ahead. Ariel Sharon, the minister responsible for settlement, produced a plan for 2 million settlers within 20 years. Time was beginning to run out for the Palestinians. The PLO presence in Beirut and Lebanon had become increasingly bloody. The Syrian army had been forced to intervene against them there in 1976. The Palestinians were dealt a devastating blow when Israel invaded Lebanon in June 1982, launching its army against PLO sanctuaries there. Egypt's President Mubarak was hugely embarrassed, since Israel's invasion was made possible because Egypt was no longer a potential Arab enemy. Codenamed Peace for Galilee, the invasion's stated aim was a quick strike to clear away PLO forces within rocket range of Israel's border communities. Within days, as Israeli troops proceeded north to Beirut, encircling the Lebanese capital, it became clear that a more ambitious plan was being pursued. Thousands of PLO fighting men, Arafat himself included, were trapped inside Beirut. Only American pressure on Israel saved them. The PLO agreed to leave under safe conduct. The Palestinians kept a stiff upper lip, but their evacuation was a huge defeat. Divided and weakened, the PLO was scattered to 8 Arab lands. From then on, for Israel, it was all downhill. Far from weakening Syria's hold on Lebanon, 3 years of Israeli occupation left President Assad of Syria master of the scene. Israel's protege, Bashir Gemayel, a young Maronite Christian and Lebanon's new strongman, was elected in August 1982. 3 weeks later, he was assassinated. Bashir had not been acceptable to the Syrians. Amin Gemayel succeeded his brother Bashir. Reluctantly, he signed a normalization treaty with Israel. But within a year, in March 1984, Assad of Syria had forced him to cancel it. An American-led multilateral force tried to bolster the Gemayel regime, but Syrian influence put paid bloodily to their intervention. 240 US Marines were killed when their Beirut headquarters was blown up in October 1983. Israel's attempt to play Lebanese politics only undermined Gemayel and isolated Israel's erstwhile Maronite Christian friends, profiting Nabi BERRI, the leader of Amal, the Shia Muslim private army, profiting above all President Assad. Not at all what the Israelis had intended. In September 1984, a new Israeli government under Shimon Peres resolved to cut its losses, deciding to withdraw its troops from Lebanon unconditionally. Its aggressive bid to control Lebanon and influence Arab politics had failed. But luckily for Israel, its peace with Egypt survived the war.